Okay, so welcome everyone to our sixth virtual session for the Evaluating Systems Change and Place-Based Approaches course. It's excellent to have you all here. As always, before we get into the course, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I meet you from today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are joining us from today, and to acknowledge their leaders past, present and emerging as well. So today's session, as I've mentioned, will be recorded as always is, and it's always lovely to see everyone's faces, but if you don't feel comfortable being recorded, please feel free to have your camera off. So today's, so the agenda for this week, hopefully you will have had an opportunity to commence the module on framing and scoping of your evaluation plan. We're going to do a quick recap at the start of this session to go through this week's learning before we go into some breakout groups to have a bit of a chat about, framing and scoping in your own context. So we'll then have some time to answer your questions at the end of the session and have a little bit more of a group discussion. So before we start, do we have any questions before we get into it? No? Everyone's feeling pretty good? Right, excellent. Okay, cool. So we've still got some people joining. So with that, I'll hand over to Elise, who's going to have a quick run through of this last week. So thanks, Elise.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. I will echo the acknowledgement of country, and I'll extend my respects to the traditional owners of the place that I'm on. And so I'm on Darkinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales. So extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging as well, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today in the virtual room. Just a quick follow-up on last week. We were talking about international examples, and so Nikki's got a couple that a colleague forwarded on to us that aren't strictly collective impact models or place-based language, in terms of we haven't really got any examples of those models being followed in the same way in the region or in some developing countries, but there are some equivalent examples. So multi-sector approaches is a different type of framework that has that cross-sector element to it, and also complexity aware is also, we've been working with the World Health Organization in Cambodia, Malaysia and a few other countries, and their terminology is around complexity, but it is systems change and also taking a place-informed approach to relational community engagement. So we'll put those links in the forum, and there's also an article from the most recent issue of American Journal of Evaluation that has an Indonesian example using theory of change and a systems-based approach that doesn't have a lot in terms of the actual case study, but it's more of theoretical representation. So that's just a few follow-ups from the conversation for those that were with us last week. And if you've got any that you found, throw them in the chat, please, because that was a really great question. We've been interested with how few examples of that model that we have actually. So in terms of a recap today, there's a few areas that I just wanted to focus on before we dive in and do some, shared questions and learning and talk together. So bear with me while I just share my screen, and I'll just run through a few points. All right, are you seeing full screen presentation mode? Beautiful, thank you. So what we covered this week is really important in terms of developing a measurement, evaluation and learning strategy, and it's really important because it can save you a lot of time. It can make it really effective and utilised. The end product is so much better when we invest some time in framing and scoping to get really clear on the purpose of what we're doing, why we're doing it, who we're doing it for. And so a really sort of good rule of thumb is to think about how will the findings through the processes, but also the outputs, the reports, the comms, the measurement reporting, how will that get used by who, for what purpose and when. And it's important to frame and scope because there's just so much to cover, particularly with complex initiatives. So getting clear on some of the boundaries of what's in and out of focus is really important. As I say, the purpose, resources is really good to acknowledge and bring that into the planning, scoping and framing stage of what resources have you got available. So it's fit for purpose what you end up designing. Audiences, primary and secondary audiences will be using the findings and data coming out of your MEL plans for different reasons. And then one of the other things that's a little bit different to standard evaluation is about clarifying the thing that you're evaluating. So the technical term is evaluand, but it's really what we're focusing on and being really clear about that, because in some of these initiatives, there are multiple parts that the evaluation might focus on. It's good to actually draw them out. So an example is with place-based collective impact initiatives, there's usually a facilitating partner or a dedicated backbone organisation that plays an enabling and support role for a wider collaboration and efforts of the whole movement. And that what they might want to evaluate, what you might want to evaluate about that enabling partner is different than the whole cross-sector collaboration and movement. And also the impact story, what both the backbone team and the whole are contributing to in terms of impact will be slightly different. And so some evaluations that we've done have both of those as part of the evaluand, but it's good to be really clear about what it is that you're evaluating. Are you evaluating the project or the initiative, the collaboration? Is it a mix of both? But the thing that's in focus. And we also dove into some case studies a bit further. So we did a little bit more on Logan Together, and we introduced the GROW example as well. And we introduced the planning tool. So the planning tool is a great, easy way that steps out framing and scoping questions, and it also carries on to the following weeks that really guides you through how to write a MEL plan for these types of settings. And in terms of things that were happening in the forum discussion board, you know, there was some feedback about the that some people liked the phases diagram, and we'll have a look at that now, and also just how effective it is to have some of these simple steps made really clear. So these planning steps this is our guide for the next few weeks. So we're on step 1 this week, and we're looking at the framing and scoping, and then we'll move on to diving in a bit more to theory of change, and then how you actually set up the questions and the methods, and also do strategic learning as part of it. So if you keep this in mind, these are the key steps that we follow when we're co-designing plans, and we're particularly focused on step 1 this week. So if I take you back to the cube, down the teal side is the theory of change that shows how that relates to stages of the initiative or phases over time up there in the orange. So a different visualization of those two sides and their relationship together was presented this week, and this is a bottom to top, very generic levels of a theory of change, and across the top in the columns is a bit of a time gauge, so you can see what is expected, set some expectations around what type of changes might be happening in what type of timeframes. Now, these are generic, so these numbers aren't widely applicable, and you do need to set realistic, or you need to make an informed you need to make informed, sort of informed guess, or you can do modelling. There's different ways, levels of robustness, but you do need to adjust this for your initiative so it reflects the type of thing that you're doing. You know, like there's research that shows that some initiatives like addressing homelessness or teenage pregnancy can happen in much less time frames through systems change than changing learning or early education outcomes for kids, where there's a bit more complexity and takes a longer time frame. So these are a guide only. It's not a fixed thing, but what we found is that it's really helpful for setting expectations of what can be reasonable at certain periods of time. So for instance, if we were doing a progress study and the initiative, place-based initiative, is in the initial early phases, so it might be in the first, might be 2 years in after getting set up, then it would not be reasonable to expect that you're going to get population level sustainable change at that high outcomes level within that time frame. So where this diagram has really helped me with some of the designs that I've done is that you can sort of point where where the initiative is in terms of time, and be able to define out what is reasonable, what we're expecting to see. We're always looking for the unexpected as well, but it does help when you've got lots of stakeholders and community want to know if they're making a difference, and funders want to know if the investment's making a difference. So chunking it out by phases is useful. So in terms of one of the questions on the forum was about this idea regarding time, because it can take a long time and things get stretched. How can you have frameworks that can tell if you're being effective, so it's not just a matter of people saying we just need more time and more investment goes into ineffective solutions. So there's lots of different thoughts that I had when I read that question, and I'm not sure if you are familiar with the question I'm talking about, if you've been reading the comments. Sometimes you can do some modelling to be able to put some lead indicators and targets and a trajectory for particular high-level outcomes. So say, for instance, if you're working on improving the outcomes for 0 to 8-year-olds, at the top of that theory change is almost it's a grand theory about early childhood development, preventative approaches, and there might be some lead indicators for health and learning that you can pinpoint at that level. You might know your cohorts and your populations that you're targeting, and that you know that you have got targets to try and reach certain proportions over certain periods of time. So you can track those longer term outcomes in that way. The tricky bit is about knowing if you're on track in the shorter term for some of those enabling conditions and the systems level changes, because that is quite slippery, and there isn't a one size fits all way to be able to do that. There's not peer reviewed research of models like there is for your health outcomes or education outcomes. And so what we find works really well is to be able to chunk it out to define what good looks like over a certain period of time, so you can get some progress markers of what change would look like in a year's time, say, for the types of systems change that you feel is needed in order to help create that longer term change. But you need to define it, and so it's not always going to be quantitative, especially down in those lower levels of knowing if you're on track. It will be things like a rubric where you can articulate in a qualitative way what it would look like for those changes that you're interested in making. So in terms of effectiveness, you can put some questions in sub-questions in effectiveness, and we'll get to this in a couple of weeks, that ask the question of, is our strategy actually relevant and appropriate to the system as it is, so that you can test about the fidelity of implementing a particular initiative or model, but you can also still be asking, is it the best strategy for how the system has moved or fit as well? And so some of those sub-questions in effectiveness can really help you pinpoint what you need to know in order to make that assessment of, are you being effective? So I hope you kept up with that if you haven't read that question. But that was a really interesting question. The other thing I just wanted to quickly touch on is this idea of capability and capacity for MEL. And so there is a difference between capability and capacity. Sometimes those terms get used interchangeably. So capability is around the skill, knowledge to be able to do the MEL work, and the capacity might be the ability of an organisation or of team members to be able to adopt new systems for measurement, evaluation and learning, to have the time, resources, capacity, and amongst all the other organisational things or change, to be able to actually deliver on it. And so they're really good things to think about, because they are critical to the success of implementing. And so it's really good to ask questions about, what do we need in order to help people who are going to implement have the capacity and capability in order to do what we're designing, and also to design to suit the readiness and the capacity that exists. It's a really important point, and it can really make MEL come unstuck if this isn't thought about. The final thing is not in the material that we shared, but I just wanted to show you this because it had an impact on me when I saw it. Mark Barr shared it. It's adapted from another innovation bell curve model, but he was applying this to where we are in adopting this sort of emergent and complexity aware approach to evaluating systems change and place-based approaches. And so while we've got the early innovations, and we've definitely got case studies, and we've got some practice-informed examples of what's working well for evaluating complex projects, we are still in the early phase of adopting it. And so often the systems aren't set up around us that support us to evaluate in a non-programmatic way. And when I saw this, it really helped me understand sometimes we bump into things like procurement processes that are set up in conventional ways for program evaluation that don't enable us to do the work, say for instance with developmental evaluation, which needs a much more flexible setup, and you're walking alongside something that's in development and you don't know the trajectory that it's going to take necessarily. There are structural and mindsets around us that we bump into as early adopters of different types of evaluation practice versus conventional program evaluation. So I just wanted to point that out, that we as a field, we're still in the early days of setting up the supports for this work, as well as the technical. We're still learning lots about how to do the technical aspect of it as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to ask a point of clarification because I did wander off there on a slide. Have you got any questions about what I covered just then? All right, lovely.
I think Nikki might have a question, just knows a hand up.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I didn't see you, Nikki.
No worries, no worries. Just kind of a question. So I feel like when we're setting this up, we kind of imagine it as being this initiative that hasn't been ongoing before. It's kind of this new idea we're going to really start. There's a starting point. And I think one of the challenges, at least in my work, is that work has been ongoing, and there's like maybe new thinking about how to approach certain problems, and that, so there's not really like a fresh starting point and saying like, great, we haven't been implementing before, now we have our baseline kind of thing. So we're sort of coming in midstream with saying, how can we work differently? And then the evaluation strategy obviously changes as well. So is there any kind of nuance in thinking about starting this kind of midstream when you've already had lots of things going on? I feel like what I usually do is like, we're trying to retrofit things or shift things in a different direction of how we do our work versus just kind of like, here's our new program plan, here's our new everything. And it's not quite like that. So just wanted to see if you had any either insights or adaptations or things to keep in mind when doing this kind of adaptations.
Just out of curiosity, Nikki, do you have measurement, evaluation, learning systems set up in the work that you do?
Yes, but they're not quite, they're geared towards a lot of the population level type of things, only in how things have been traditionally set up and aligned with our strategy, our corporate strategy, but not really towards this kind of systems level change. And people haven't been really thinking about that. It's just, if you train people, great, we'll input something, we'll distribute food, and then we'll reduce malnutrition and food security and other indicators. It's very quite traditional. So like the population type of indicators are there, but the other types of things or ways of thinking and measuring change at a lower level or the enabling level are not.
Two common scenarios that I see is either the strategy changes, so you actually shift what you're doing, the way you're doing it, and so you need a refresh, to check that your MEL systems are supporting the new strategy and getting the data that you need. And then the second scenario is often, I think, more probably aligned with what you're describing, that there are phases or iterations of MEL design. And so often with place-based initiatives and particularly with collective impact as well, it has this sort of shared measurement principle as part of it. One of the first starting points is to get those high-level outcomes defined and do population level, long-term targets of what we're aiming to change, which is great. And so that sits up there. But then what often happens is that after that gets set, and there's a bit of a roadmap that's developed for how to create those population level changes, then the work gets iterated, and it's almost like the next iteration is, okay, so we've got our Northern Star and our tracking system. How do we know in 2 years' time if we're on track, ahead of getting there? And then often after that higher level shared measurement, then the attention jumps down to, okay, so what are the systems changes that we're actively trying to influence it, and how can we tell if we're making a difference on that, and then bring MEL down into those lower levels. So it's quite common that there's sort of stages of, what gets designed and what gets focused on. Interested to hear from others. What sort of scenarios? Yeah, thanks, Yolanda.
I was actually just curious, maybe for you to expand on that. I'm involved as a citizen with Logan Together, so that's the collective impact case study that we have here. And so they started off with the population-based changes, but of course the attribution is very difficult if you stick to population-based measures. And I was just left curious as to how are they following? Is there a space in this kind of work to then follow families that they might service in the system, so that you can actually really have a handle on attribution, or how do the measures sort of refine down so that you can really start to get to the attribution part of the equation?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really important part of this work is setting yourselves up so you've got data and ways to be able to look at the contribution story. So in this type of realm where there's lots of partners and stakeholders, and there's often lots of initiatives that might be, so either collectively lots of people might be working together for a shared goal, or there might actually be multiple initiatives in one place working towards a common type of goal. we don't tend to talk about attribution anymore in terms of that there's one program or, you know, one causal factor that will influence change. And that's what's really tricky about it, is that there are multiple forces happening and multiple things contributing. So the language that we're using is contribution analysis, where you are trying to do an evidence-based assessment of what your contribution has been to change, and you're also acknowledging what other influencing factors may have led to that, so you get a bigger picture of the change process and what led to that. So there's different techniques to be able to do that, from a really simple tool that we've got on our website called the What Else, actually it's in the toolkit that we share, called the What Else test, and it's even just a basic scan of what else could have contributed before we make this outcome claim that we've led to it. What else could have contributed to that? So you can just do a general process of eliminating and having your eyes wide open about what was happening, right up to really technical processes like John Mayne's contribution analysis. And then there's sort of everything in between. At the moment, I'm working on a hybrid version of a contribution analysis, and we're using a theory of change approach, but we're evidencing the links, the causal links up the chain of events and influences to see the extent of contribution, the extent of significance, and the role of partners in that contribution for a particular initiative. So yeah, it's really important to, because measurement can tell you if your targets are improving or not, but it doesn't tell you why and how. And so that's where evaluation fits into it. So measurement alone tell you about the trends. Evaluation can say to what extent, or, you know, do we contribute, or is it good enough? It has that sort of judgment to it, but it can dive in and ask these evaluative questions that measurement alone won't be able to tell you. And one of them is contribution.
Liz, could I just ask a little bit more, for a little bit more explanation, perhaps as an example, and perhaps to give you the reason why I'm struggling is I've come from a science frame, so where, you know, epidemiology and sociology, so you literally follow people for years doing surveys, and so with complex statistical analysis, you can really draw out the complex from the complexity. And really isolate sort of effect sizes. But I've noticed in this space, that's not something that's done. And I've yet to learn a lot more about the collective impact and community space. So I still have my L plates on, but I'm just trying to sort of build the bridge between my frame of reference and what tends to get done, and really getting in those hard measures to then be able to fathom out the contribution.
So say randomized control trials.
No, that they're population-based studies. So because randomized control trials wouldn't be appropriate for a population.
Oh yeah, that's what I was just going to say.
Yeah.
So that's often, you know, held as at one level of sort of gold standard for this type of testing, and so that's not applicable in these contexts at all. And so there definitely the longitudinal studies is really important, and so having research partners who are able to be able to support this arm of the work is really important. And so because it takes time and you need the data collected over you know, a longer period of time, over years, to be able to do that analysis and to be able to determine if the changes are significant, you know, statistically significant, and also what the plausible contribution might be from the cohorts that you're working with and the levels of change that you've been working on in influencing your initiative with changes or trends that you might be seeing. So there's a great role for the quantitative analysis to play, definitely, in the higher level outcomes. It's just that it takes a longer time and it's really technical. So usually collaborations communities or organisations doing this need some sort of research partner to be able to support that, because it's very detailed, and it does need to be set up at the beginning, which is why people often start there, because you need to set that up so you've got a baseline and you've got your mechanisms in place. But yeah, the more data and the more time, the more you can do with it for contribution.
And is that a thing that's being done in the collective impact space? I've not seen it anywhere, but it just could be because I'm new to it. I've just yes, it's had that as a question mark for some time now.
Yeah, I think, sorry guys, I might just have to, I just want to jump in because we do have breakout activity, but it's a really interesting and important question you've got, like Yolanda, so I'll make a note of it so that we can come back to it. But just want to make sure that we've got time for the breakout groups. So apologies for interrupting, but just want to make sure we move into that. So what we're going to do now is break into breakout groups. We've put a link in the chat to some slides that we'll be getting you to work on together. So in each group, you've got an opportunity to discuss how, in your context, you may include people in developing a MEL framework. So it's great to take these discussion points into that breakout. So the aim is a chance for you to get together and learn from your own experiences, but also from each other. And there's also going to be time at the end so that you can bring anything back to the main group if you've got those unanswered questions. So just a reminder, you will need to self-facilitate a little bit. And try and create space for those quieter folks in the group to have an opportunity to talk as well. So we're going to have about 15 minutes for this, and then we'll come back and have about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion as well. So any questions before I push you into your groups and release you? No? Okay, cool. All right, well, we'll see you back in about 15 minutes. Awesome. Thanks all. Natalie, have you? Natalie, are you there? I've tried to assign you to room 3. Oops, stop. All right, great guys. Hi and welcome back. I think we've got just about everyone back in the main room now. So what we'll be doing now is we're going to go around the different groups and we'll be going through your the summary points of your discussion and any questions that you've got to feed back to the group. So what we'll do is we'll start with room 1. So this is the room that had Cass, Mike, Nikki and Sophie in it. Would you guys be happy to nominate someone and talk us through what you have to chat about?
I'm going to phone's working. Can you hear me okay?
You sound a little bit like a robot.
You know, maybe we can do maybe I'll go in some of the just kind of overview, and others can add on from our group. So in general, we were kind of, we got as far as really talking about the different initiatives, at least from my side, coming from Eastern Africa, we have several different initiatives we're working on and trying to shift the strategy. And one is within Somalia, and it's around food systems with the ultimate goal around reducing malnutrition rates and increasing food security. But that's very big. And maybe one thing that's helped us do this scoping a little bit, and we're not even at the stage of actually setting down an evaluation plan yet, but we're at the theory of change side, is we have a food systems framework that has been recently kind of put together, which has helped us sort of pick apart different things. And then we also have our strategic plan for the corporate strategic plan, which helps pick out the themes within our mandate and kind of focus it that way a bit. But in terms of what really matters, like we always come up against these issues around poverty, and that's underlying so many of the things why people can't afford nutritious foods in certain ways. And that's definitely beyond our mandate, but then we need the partners to do it. So the scoping is still a bit tricky, and I kind of told our group the bane of my existence right now, because it's just huge and it's at a whole country level. So it's it's just not small and kind of tangible, so it's a bit hard. Maybe my other group, we also talked about an education initiative and child well-being and I was typing, so maybe my colleagues can add on to that.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I was just talking about the Connected Beginnings program I work for the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, and our program supports 22 communities across Australia in urban, regional and remote locations. So our population impact is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children aged 0 to 5 years are healthy, safe and ready to thrive at school. I guess from a scoping perspective, it's difficult because we need to weigh in what the appetite of Commonwealth Government is in terms of seeing impact and change and rapid impact. I spoke about generally that there's a reluctance or appetite to actually fund something that you don't really see results. And given the fact that a lot of these social impact initiatives, they do take a considerable amount of time to actually see population level changes. Generally, the appetite within government is the minister wants to see something that would sees results within that 3 to 4 year election cycle window. So, we're driven by the Closing the Gap, the new National Partnership Agreement now, and our program directly targets that school readiness target. But my point was that we shouldn't be just focused on that particular target as when you sort of get narrow sight and narrow focus, generally you don't see the other things that are happening in the community. Even though it'd be great to sort of hit those targets, we need to evaluate and scope on all the changes, look at the impact that our initiative has in those communities holistically. But it's just weighing all those elements up.
Brilliant. Thank you both. It sounds like some really interesting discussion and some really interesting initiatives, but also definitely raising some of those complexities around scoping in these contexts. Okay, cool. So I just want to move on to room 2. If you have any outstanding questions, maybe could you pop them in the chat in the meantime, just in case there's anything that didn't feel was resolved. So room 2 had Anne, Katrina, Megan and Rosalie in it. Will I have to nominate someone to do the report back on behalf of the group?
Please, not me.
Oh, well, but now you're off mute, Anne.
Ah, that's done it. Katrina, you had lots to say. Okay, I'll gather what I can recall. But so with the framing and scoping, where we kind of landed in our discussion too was a lot around the community readiness, that they need to be ready to be doing that together, and if they're not, then it's probably not going to work. And I think it was different. Katrina, please feel free to jump in, because what you were talking about was different from my context, where we were really kind of starting at the beginning, and so our scoping of the MEL was really just around like the Harwood readiness kind of stuff. So we were really just thinking about and focused on the backbone, where do we want to be kind of by the end of this sort of first little stage, where would we hope to be? And so we kind of used that to scope out what we were going to evaluate. Katrina, do you want to speak to what your context was like? Nope. Okay. And then with the developing the framework, so we had their like goals to build the capacity and resources in the communities to enable a sustainable community-led programming, so involving the community at that stage, and that if you're doing like a multi-site thing, that you're working with the communities at their level to develop their own strategies around their specific needs. And I think to the from my experience anyway, that helping to sort of identify like what the values are, like working with the people involved to identify what the values are that they want to evaluate, so that they're part of the process from the start up.
Excellent, thank you.
Then I'll just jump in to say that was a really good point, is sometimes you chunk it out, and so you frame and scope what you might need to start off with, and then you might do the next iteration of it. But to be able to do a smaller timeline is also can sometimes be appropriate, rather than the 5-year MEL strategy.
And that's really where we are too, Elise. I think too now, as the projects are taking shape in different directions, that's becoming more and more kind of necessary to just go, okay, well, where's it going to go? But they're going in a different direction. So we're tailoring it all to each one then.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, group 2. So I'm just aware of the time, so don't want to cut off discussion, but also want to make sure that everyone has a chance to share. So room 3, we had Lucy, Natalie, and Paula. So if you'd like to give us a quick summary of what you did, how your discussion went. Maybe Lucy, would you like to tell us what your group?
I would love to, can't you tell? I will though, just to save time. So Paula was in a shopping mall, so it was very noisy, but Paula, I'm not going to be able to give a summary of what you were talking about. She was saying it's all about the stage of the work that she's doing, but she's definitely feeling that she's learning a lot from this course that she's going to bring to it. It's a bit ironic that she's doing the course now rather than a while back. Okay, so Stephanie, we had a really bad line with Stephanie, and she was talking about education. The bits I picked up were around education, and a key focus, I think, for Stephanie, I may be wrong, Steph, I'm sorry, was around not kind of creating a framework that was, too complicated and going to create a bigger data burden, that actually built on existing data that was there, and, using, it sounded as if it was education data that was already being collected. And Natalie's up in, she's normally in East Arnhem, and Natalie was making a point around the tricky bits of, when funders are normally funding a project and want a project evaluated as opposed to a systems change kind of evaluation. So how do you build that sort of systems change breadth into get a funder to see the value of that, and what they're really looking at is, the specific project outcomes. And that coincided with some of the challenges I'm having in my role, in that some of our funding is for a collective impact project, and some of it is for some specific projects which, involve building things, and not everybody's signed up for the collective impact experience. So, we're going to have to scoping out our framework and actually pushing, getting systems change into the picture is going to be a bit of work in itself, I think. But yeah, we talked about all sorts of things, but that'll do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It sounds like it was a really interesting conversation, and thank you for that summary, Lucy. Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes left, so we'll just open the floor to room 4. So that was Stacey, Talia, Yolanda, and I think Emma, but I think she's had to head off. So Stacey, I see that you've already unmuted.
I'll go very quickly because I know we're short of time. But none of us are actually working on projects at the moment, so we found it a bit difficult. So I've talked about a project from a job that I've just left. I've just finished up on Friday. It's called the Logan Solutions and Reform Project. So it is in Logan. Logan Together is one of the partners. We've got a number of partners, including the Benevolent Society and the Department of Child Safety and the Community Services Industry Alliance. And the Logan Solutions and Reform Project is basically a 12-month experiment that came out of a funding contract that the Benevolent Society have with Child Safety. They got a variation to do something a bit different with a piece of funding, a small piece of funding. Logan Together came in with some additional funding as well. But fundamentally, the project is that it's really about marrying local level solutions and, that interagency working together kind of on the ground frontline collaborative projects with the system reform that usually gets missed. So all of the pressure for, delivering better services and, better referral pathways and all of that's pushed to the front line. Whereas what really does need to happen is that kind of middle space between, the frontline work and this high level policy change that takes forever to occur. What can we actually drive into that middle space at the local level to get reform happening? So the project was really built around a theory of change that was built to scope. It was built to scale. So it was saying, well, we've got 12 months. What can we realistically change in 12 months? So it was really focused on what are those enablers that we can do. So let's do some demonstration projects, but let's actually use those demonstration projects around priority areas to drive improvements in local level system leadership. And those leadership and governance processes that we can put in place that can have a longer term impact in terms of, how this system, the system in Logan, the sector in Logan works together to drive higher level system reform. So it was a bit weird. We kind of got to the point of the midpoint review, which is underway right now. And that's kind of showing that, what we aimed to achieve by the midpoint, we have actually achieved. And, in terms of building those cycles of innovation that we wanted to do as a result of this project, we're looking like we're on track to do that. So that's really cool.
Brilliant. That's great to hear. Thank you so much, Stacey, for sharing that example and also the discussion from your group. So unfortunately, we have reached the end of today's session. So thank you so much for all of your questions and engagement today. So a quick note is that next week we'll have our CEO, Dr. Jess Dark, coming to talk about the theory of change in a place-based context. So please have some questions ready for her to tackle in that question. Bring us some curly ones. And there's just a quick note from Elise that if you have any framing or scoping questions, bring them into the discussion boards, and that's a place where we can continue these discussions that we've started here. So thank you all once again for joining today, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks very much.
See you later, everyone.